There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised.
It's just after midday on July 17, 2014, when 283 passengers and 15 crew members board MH17 at Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. Among the passengers are 12-year-old Mo, 10-year-old Evie, and 8-year-old Otis Maslin, along with their 68-year-old grandfather, Nick Norris. MH17 is bound for Kuala Lumpur's International Airport, due to arrive at 6:10 a.m. local time. The family would then go on to Perth, Australia, where they live. But a few hours into the flight, the plane loses contact with air traffic control. The last known point of contact is about 50 kilometres from the Russia-Ukraine border. The parents of Mo, Evie and Otis are in Amsterdam, spending 2 more days in the city before heading home to join their kids. That afternoon, they think to themselves how lucky they are, how life doesn't get any better than this. Late that night, they'll receive a phone call. They are thrown into what they will later describe as a living hell. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with podcaster and author Michelle Laurie, the co-host of the podcast Australian True Crime. Michelle's latest book, CSI Told You Lies, tells the stories of the forensic scientists on the front line of Australia's major crime and disaster investigations, including the shooting down of flight MH17 over Ukraine in 2014. Can you describe the Maslin family prior to July 2014? What kind of family were they?
They were the kind of family who made really hard things look easy. That's how I would describe them. Things that I think are impossible. And in the book, I say that they made international travel look easy. International travel with small children. You know, I make a trip to the park look really difficult with my children. But they had these 3 little tiny children, Marit and Anthony Maslin. Or Marit's not a Maslin, she's Norris, even though they're married. She's, they're this kind of people, just really cool couple, a beautiful looking couple, beautiful spiritual couple. They're fun, they're in love. You can just look at them, you can see that they're just in love. They're sexy, they're funny, they're smart. And I don't even know what their business was, but it involved travel, international travel. And they had these beautiful 3 little children, Mo, Evie and Otis. They were all under 12 and they were just whirling around the planet. They went and lived in Mauritius for a while and they were back and forth between Amsterdam a lot. At this stage, they were there in Amsterdam with Rin's dad. Granddad Nick was there with them. And Granddad Nick was bringing the kids back to Perth. They were from Perth and he was bringing them back to Perth. And Rin and Maz were staying on in Amsterdam for just a couple of days alone together, just a couple of days for mum and dad, and then they were going to follow everyone back to Perth. But Perth was still their home base, and so the kids were in footy teams and all that kind of stuff. So these children were those worldly children that we all dream we're going to have, we all promise ourselves we're going to have, so they were quite happy at the fish and chip shop in Scarborough in Perth. They were also quite happy on the canals in Amsterdam, these children. Beautifully behaved, beautiful manners, kind children, smart children and world travellers.
You write in the book that they were so used to travelling that they kind of had their little processes, you'd sit down and they might watch a movie or play a game.
Oh, my gosh. My son Louis will not sleep on a plane until 20 minutes before it lands. No matter how long the flight, it could be an hour city flyer. It could be, 12 hours. That child will not sleep. He will sit there and not let me sleep until 20 minutes before the flight lands, and so I have to carry him off. But these kids were very well travelled, They just had each of them had their little things they like to do, and they just got on the plane and got their little processes going.
You can tell those well-seasoned travellers, and
Yes.
It sounds like those 3 kids were them. And on July 17, 2014, they got onto a plane with their granddad, Nick. What happened to that flight? Their parents received a phone call several hours later. What were they told had taken place?
Well, their parents were asleep. It was the middle of the night in Amsterdam, and so the phone was ringing downstairs in their apartment. And eventually Maz got up to answer the phone, and it was his PA back in Perth, and she was sort of yelling hysterically, "Tell me your kids weren't on that plane." And eventually I'm getting shivers thinking about it, and eventually he calmed her down to say, what plane? What are you talking about? And she said MH17. Well, he couldn't remember what their flight number was or anything like that. And he sat down and he went through the emails and dug out the flight number, and he realised that was their flight number, and he Googled it. And unfortunately, by that time, the images had already started to circulate, and that's how they started to understand what had happened, that MH17 had been shot down over Ukraine.
And when you say images had begun to circulate, I mean, they were almost early evidence of what had happened. What did those images capture?
They captured the crash scene outside of Donetsk in Ukraine. Initially, it was a crash. I mean, that's what we woke up to in Australia, was that a plane had crashed. I was working at Nova at the time, doing breakfast radio, and I remember I used to wake up and grab my phone next to the bed and quickly have a look at the news, because that's what my work morning would be all about. And I flicked it on and I saw a Malaysian Airlines flight had crashed, and I couldn't believe it, because it was only a couple of months earlier that a Malaysian Airlines plane had disappeared. And I'll never forget walking into the radio station and looking at Tommy Little, who I was doing the show with, and we just looked at each other, our mouths open, and he's just shaking his head at me and I was shaking my head at him. We couldn't believe it, and we knew that that's what our morning would be about, and the next morning and the next morning and the week would be this awful tragedy. And, we're comedians, and we're trying to do this fun breakfast show, and we were just like, oh my God, it's just so awful. And as that morning rolled out, and we have the TV screens around in the radio station, we could see the news rolling out that it didn't crash, it was shot down. It was an accident. Some army somewhere has shot down a passenger plane. And then you realise the soldiers, hang on a minute, they're not normal soldiers. Who are these guys? They're picking through the crash site, and they're holding up people's passports, and they're holding cigarettes, and it's just the most horrible scenes. They were militia. Couldn't tell what side they were on. Who are the sides? It was chaos.
And then there was the woman who reported having a body fall through her ceiling. Was a crime scene established? Because as you say, you've got someone with a cigarette in one hand and they're going through passenger passports at the same time, potentially contaminating a crime scene. Was this being set up as it needed to be?
Well, it's a crash scene. I mean, to this day, it would be called a crash scene because there's still legal action underway, and the Russian government maintains that it's not a crime, that there's no crime been committed, or that they don't have anything to do with it. So, it's a very contentious choice of words that you've used there. A lot of people, certainly a lot of families, would agree with you and call it a crime scene. But at the time, it was called a crash scene. And it was chaos, and the people on the ground in the village very close to the crash scene just talked about hearing this explosion and seeing people, literally old ladies said they saw people falling from the sky. And once the noise had stopped, and and they realised the plane had crashed and everything had finished, and they came out of their homes, some of them went looking eventually for the bodies because they realised that the soldiers weren't letting teams in to recover the remains. It was such a strange environment because really and truly it seems as though the soldiers on the ground were probably trying to hide evidence of a missile that had hit the plane, and so for that reason weren't allowing international investigation teams in to recover the remains for days. And so some of the local ladies, the elderly ladies, were worried that the bodies wouldn't never be recovered because they were falling into fields of sunflowers, very tall, like 9 feet high sunflowers, and the ladies were worried that they were going to be lost in there. So they, because they remembered having seen where they'd fallen, they went out and put markers out there, like tore shreds off their clothes or took rags out there and big sticks and dug the sticks into the ground and put the fabric onto the end. Sometimes they covered the bodies because they just thought it was so undignified that these bodies were left in the sun, left just out like that. Also, it rained after a couple of days, so that obviously was terrible. So they covered them in even cast iron in some cases because it was all they had was just like roofing iron.
Did the Ukrainian officials do anything in those early days to preserve the bodies?
Well, the Ukrainian officials had no access to the site either because there were separatists who had possession of the patch of ground. There was actually no government access at all to the site. So the Ukrainian separatists are backed by Russia. So this was completely lawless, this patch of land. So eventually, after a couple of days, I think maybe the old ladies shamed them into it, the soldiers gave access to the local SES. The Ukrainian SES were given access to the site to start recovering bodies. And then when that happened, a lot of local men volunteered. Men from the local mine volunteered to come and help assist with body recovery, which must have been an incredibly daunting thing for them to do. They're complete amateurs at this job, and it must have been a very difficult site by then. I think the bodies had been there for about 3 days by that stage. I guess they realised they had to do something to preserve the remains, so they used a substance called formalin, which is formaldehyde mixed with something, because I think that's all they had. That's all they had access to. And it comes from like funeral homes. It's illegal in Australia now. It's banned in Australia and America and the UK because it's so toxic. And especially in like these doses, it can like give you pneumonia in 2 seconds or something when you inhale it. But that's all they had. And I guess they wouldn't even know that that's what it can do. So they doused the bodies in this concoction, and that had a lot of repercussions down the track because from that moment on, the bodies became toxic effectively.
One expert in those early days noticed that none of the victims were wearing watches or jewellery, I believe. What had taken place there?
Well, we'll never know for sure, but it certainly suggested that looting had taken place at the crash scene. Also, the lividity patterns on the bodies suggested that they'd been moved around a bit. So it suggested that they had lain in one position for a certain period of time, but that wasn't the position that they were in when they were recovered.
What was the role of David Ranson? What was he called in to do?
So David Ranson is a forensic pathologist who works at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine, and he's a senior pathologist. He's worked there for a very long time. So forensic pathologists are the people who do the postmortems, autopsies, and he's also an expert in victim identification. He's worked at the Bali bombings and other sort of big things like that, big tragedies like that. The tsunami, he went to Thailand and did trips to the tsunami. So he is one of the probably top 20 people in the world. So when there's a big event like this, he usually gets the call to come and work at it. he went to Hilversum in the Netherlands, which is where the royal family decided that they wanted to have the bodies repatriated to, where they set up this laboratory, state-of-the-art laboratory in an old airplane hangar, like a World War II hangar. And they set up the teams there to identify the remains of the dead there, because you can imagine it was not only a forensic operation, but it was a very political operation.
And that's what I was going to ask. If him as an Australian, is it his job to come in and just deal with the Australian bodies? Because I believe there were 27 Australians in that crash. Does he deal with all of them or just the Australian?
No, I thought that. I always thought that, but no, it's not. So they have this system where every pathologist or every sort of team, small team of pathologists just takes one job. And so everyone's set up at their station and they take one responsibility each when they're doing one of these disaster victim identification projects, they're called, DVI. So, for example, his job was DNA. So all he did all day was extract DNA samples from remains. So every set of remains arrives and is seen by every group of specialists. So one group is just cataloguing tattoos and body markings all day, and then they pass the remains on to the next group who might do DNA, and then they pass the remains on to the next group who are doing bloods. Then they pass it on to the next group who are doing teeth, odontology, dentistry. And so in that way, then all of that information is collated and it's matched up against the descriptions from the families of the missing. So there's no one person responsible for identifying one set of remains. So you end up with this sort of incredible cross-checking of information.
And you interviewed him for your book. I can't imagine how confronting that scene would have been for someone, but of course this is part of what he does for a living. How did he describe that experience of walking in and seeing all those bodies?
Oh, he is so focused on the lab, like how much he loved the laboratory at Hilversum. He's a very jaunty person in general, British guy who loves Monty Python and the Goons, and he's like, in his 50s, late 50s probably, and he's one of those great compartmentalisers. So for him, his immediate reaction when I say, oh, wow, so tell me about that job, he's just like, oh, you should have seen the lab. Oh, you should have seen the laboratory. It was amazing. It was like this big hangar and the equipment, and, because the Netherlands, they put so much money into it, and yeah, he was just all about this state-of-the-art laboratory initially. And then, once we started talking about the rest of the stuff, his vibe changed. But his initial reaction was just about how amazing the setup was in the laboratory.
And is it his job to determine the cause of death of these people he's looking at, or to just identify them?
It's not even his job to identify them. It's just his job to extract DNA. That's the thing about these guys, is they're very focused on what their specific job is in any moment. So in that job, he was just extracting DNA. That's it. He's not trying to even identify anybody. He's just there to do the best he can do. And as he said, the beauty of doing it that way is that you do a really good job of extracting DNA. That's all you have to do. You don't have to think about anything else, worry about anything else. You just do a really good job of that because it's all you're doing all day. And then you sort of don't get caught up in the big picture. And he said, even when you're doing a full postmortem, don't think about the big picture. Just stay really focused on the small bits. Even the old coppers say that. Just stay small and just think about, all I need to do is think about where the bullet went in, which way it went, and how did it come out. Just keep it small and just stay on task.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with author Michelle Laurie about her upcoming book, CSI Told You Lies. Did we ever find out why and how that plane was shot down? What was discovered ultimately about that case?
Well, it was a no-fly zone for civilian aircraft under 30,000 feet already. There had been, I think, 2 or 3 military planes shot down in that area in the previous week. This plane was definitely above that level, so it wasn't pilot error at all. I mean, obviously, had the passengers known that, it was a no-fly zone under 30,000 feet, I'm sure they all would have voted to not go anywhere near there anyway. But a lot of us don't realise that these conditions happen a lot around the world, and we're unaware of them. This is the reality of flying internationally. So it was an accident. It was definitely an accident. It was most likely a book missile. Within hours, people had found online lots and lots of imagery uploaded to social media by these separatists showing off about their beautiful big Russian book missile. They showed the missile launcher driving around the villages in the area, driving out to the launch site and launching the missile that actually took down the plane. It was an accident. I guess they thought it was a military plane, and because they're just dum-dums. They're not soldiers. They had this incredibly powerful piece of equipment, and they didn't really know what they were doing with it. I think I figured out there were about 45,000 civilians who travelled through that space in the previous 12 hours.
Oh, my goodness.
And this plane was just the unlucky one, unfortunately.
And the Maslin family, they lost on that day Mo and Evie and Otis and their granddad, Nick. You interviewed them as well, and as you described before, they're just such, energetic. They sound very funny. They sound full of life. What does their life look like now? They've had another child, haven't they?
They have. They've got a daughter called Violet. And, their life looks still just so energetic and full. And as I say, they're not just surviving, they're thriving. I mean, Maz started a whole new business a couple of years ago. Some amazing, I can't even get my head around it, but it's some great ethical food, brilliant thing, living in Perth. Oh, Rin started an art space. They're just so brilliant. I didn't just interview them. We worked together, completely together on this chapter. They read every word of it. I sent it to them chunk by chunk, and they would send it back with corrections or with suggestions. They're incredibly engaged in life. Like, they're not even just engaged considering what they've been through. Like, they're more engaged in life than most people you will ever meet.
I remember that Australian Story episode. It's one of the best I think I've ever seen, and their resilience. And I remember them talking about, was it the web of love or something that their friends and family did, where they looked after them in the days and weeks afterwards? Like, it's just such an incredible family.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, it's not even like they say, oh, we don't know how we do it. They do know, and they'll tell you, like they'll say, okay, this is how we do it. This is how we did it then. This is how we do it now. They're extraordinary. So I love that. I love people like that. I love people who aren't shy to say, yeah, we know it's amazing what we're doing, and this is how we do it.
I loved what they said as well about how they see other people who are on the street and they're grumpy or they're having a go at someone, and they think, you know what, we've had a worse time than you and we can behave.
I know.
And I just loved that. None of us have an excuse.
No, they're great. They're like, I don't know what happened to them, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't as bad as what happened to us.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm looking at a photo of them right now on my desktop, actually, with Violet, and just saying to them, you can say anything to them too. That's what I love about them. And just being able to say to them, when I read you were having a baby, I thought, oh no.
Yeah, yeah.
And they laughed and laughed. I said, oh, I'm such an asshole. But I just thought, oh, guys, no.
Yeah.
Oh, are you sure? And I'd never met them. And they were just laughing about, how strangers, how we think we know them, and we think we can say that shit about them. And they were like, oh, mate, you got no idea the things people say to us. But they told me the best thing one time, their daughter Violet was in the paper for something completely else. Like she just happened to be at a cafe or something and the person said, oh, do you mind if we take a photo of your little girl for the paper? And they were like, yeah, okay. And then when they saw her in the paper, she was just Violet enjoying a cupcake at the cafe. And they were so happy because it had nothing to do with MH17. Nothing. She was just happened to be this really cute little girl at the cafe that the guy from the paper spotted and thought, oh, she'd be great. I'll see if she's allowed to be in the paper.
I wanted to ask broadly about your book and the CSI effect. You write about that early on and how it can actually cause a lot of issues. What is the CSI effect and how does it play out?
I know, it's fabulous, isn't it? I'd never heard of it, but when I started talking to the pathologists, they all, somewhere in the conversation, and they still do, every single time, bring up CSI. Every time, one of them will go, no, not like CSI. It's not like CSI, is it? I just think, God, why are you so grumpy about CSI? Because I never really watched CSI. I prefer true crime, right? So then I started researching it, and what it is this American university actually coined the phrase the CSI effect. It's this thing where when people on a jury have watched a lot of crime, either true crime or crime fiction, they can become so confident in their own knowledge of forensics, what they perceive to be their own knowledge of forensics, that they don't trust forensics experts. Like if a forensics expert gives testimony in court and says, well, I don't really know what time she died, then the juror might think, well, you're not very good at this, are you?
Because on CSI last night, they knew that they died at exactly 4:13 p.m.
Yeah, everybody knows that you should know. So they might not trust their evidence, any of their other evidence. Or a juror might think, well, I'll just figure it out for myself then because I actually know heaps about forensics. So jurors were starting to just make up their own minds about forensic evidence because they thought they knew heaps about it anyway, and they weren't really paying too much attention to the specialists. So they're up against it anyway because they've always had to try to explain really complicated biological evidence. But now they're trying to convince jurors that they're wrong about it, not just try to explain it to lay people, but actually try and convince them that, no, trust me, I do know more than you do about it. Even though you're a massive CSI fan, I get it. Yeah, it's a real thing. It's a real thing. So this other criminologist then in the States conducted an audit of CSIs, forensics kind of stuff. And he found that 40% of their procedures don't exist at all.
Oh, my God.
And it's very inaccurate because the maker of CSI once said he thought his show was very educational. And so that really upset them.
Yeah, and even the idea, that you can, solve a crime in a neat 30 to 40-minute time slot or however long it goes
in a leather jacket.
Yeah, exactly, while having, a romantic relationship on the side.
I know, on the side of the table.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I know, it makes them so angry.
I finally wanted to ask, what are the most problematic lies that CSI tells us? Do you think it's that it's just that simplistic and that DNA and forensics can tell us absolutely everything? Is that what the experts are annoyed about?
Yeah, for them, they talk about the fact that a lot of their work is grey. It's grey area, and that they find that increasingly jurors look to them for black and white answers, for just absolutes, and they're shocked to discover that they don't have them, that all they can do is give them approximates. And that did surprise me, I have to say. I thought, you're scientists, what do you mean? Don't you? I said, no, we don't. And I was surprised by things like, reading a lot of their sort of reports and their autopsy reports, and even for this book, reading about cases where pathologists had to go into court and say, yeah, look, I know she was with that serial killer and I know he stabbed her, but she also had a heart condition. So what I'm saying is, I don't know which one killed her first. She might have died of a heart attack before he stabbed her. And that's the thing. It's things like that where, really, I don't know if he murdered her because she had all these chronic health issues. So any one of those could have killed her first. Things like that are the truth of the matter when you're a forensic pathologist, and these are the things you have to tell a jury, whether they like it or not.
And again, that's about looking at the details and not telling stories, because it's not the job of these scientists to tell stories, I suppose.
Or to find a perpetrator. That's the other thing on the telly. It's sort of like, well, that's none of your business, mate. Don't worry about that. It's not your business if he looks dodgy. Just do the autopsy, all right, and then tell the cops what you think. It's none of that's their business. It's just their business to find out, to be the voice of the deceased. That's what they say. I'm their voice.
Michelle Laurie is a respected Australian broadcaster, known for her work in television, radio and podcasting. She's also written 5 books, the latest of which is her first release in the true crime genre. Titled CSI Told You Lies, the book focuses on the real-life work of forensic scientists on the front line of Australia's major crime and forensic investigations. You can find a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you want more true crime or want to connect with other true crime fans, search True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join our group. And if you've been enjoying our recent episodes, then please let us know. Leave us a review on your favourite podcast app.